How I became a Doctor Who fan. Everyone has their own story of how they became a Doctor Who fan, and they're almost always interesting and very individual, so I thought I might share my own story, just for a bit of a change. I was always aware of Doctor Who growing up. My brother had the 1972 Doctor Who Annual and the Doctor Who Monster book, which were then inevitably passed down to me along the way. My very earliest memory of the show is of the end of Part 1 of Destiny of the Daleks, which I am presuming was the repeat, as I have no memory of anything else from Season 17 or 18 except for Logopolis. I know that my brother and I did watch the Five Faces of Doctor Who season on BBC Two, although the only thing I can even vaguely remember is Carnival of Monsters and complaining about Logopolis being on again. I have vague memories of many stories from seasons 19 to 22, so I obviously saw a fair bit, and I remember watching Part 1 of Trial of a Time Lord in 1986, not liking it and keeping looking in the radio times for when the next story would start. You can probably guess how that went. But in all absolute honesty, Doctor Who was nothing at all special to me then. It was just another TV show. My childhood TV obsessions were much more along the lines of soap, The Little Vampire, Robin of Sherwood and V. But that all changed Christmas 1986. My brother had been intending to buy me a VHS copy of Back to the Future, only to find it was actually going to be that year's big BBC movie premiere on Christmas Day. He eventually resorted, largely out of desperation I can only presume, to getting me a copy of the novelization of, rather randomly, The Savages. As I noted in my Season 3 review, I was vaguely familiar with Hartnell via the Monster book and knew he traveled with his granddaughter and two teachers. I had no idea who the hell Dodo and Stephen were and actually thought they might have been made up just for the book and that the book itself might have been an original novel, that is not based on a telly story. I had no idea that original novels of that kind were still some way off at that point. I wasn't all that impressed with the present, to be honest, though eventually in a cloud of post-Christmas I'm bored it is, I resorted to reading it. And for whatever reason, something in that scrappy little paperback caught my still preteen imagination. I fell in love with it. In fact, I fell in love with the whole idea. I began getting Who books out of the library by the dozen, with my Bible at the time being Peter Haining's much-loved 20th Anniversary Series Overview book, A Celebration. Needless to say, eventually I became unsatisfied with just reading books and wanted to see the actual show. Fat chance of that at that point in time, with videos thin on the ground and terribly expensive, and even less chance of repeats. However, the first story I got on video was Revenge of the Cybermen, which I somehow managed to acquire in August 1987. I've no idea how or why I got it, since that's not anywhere near my birthday or anything, but I managed it somehow. I lapped it up, though deep inside I was actually a little bit disappointed by it. I don't like it all now, to be honest. And one of my snottier brothers broke into pearls of hysterical laughter at the Vogons being hysterical over how many Cybermen had arrived. 2. At least. The cunt. Of course, after that I got to see my first full season proper as a fan, with the broadcast of Sylvester McCoy's first season as the 7th Doctor, season 24. I absolutely loved it at the time, and while it certainly isn't one of my favorites today, I'm still rather fond of it, particularly Dragonfire. The bile that gets thrown at this season is somewhat understandable but rather over the top nonetheless, and it's still better than large chunks of new Who shite. Christmas 1987 saw my Who video collection expand with the VHS copies of Day and Death to the Daleks. Enjoyed both at the time, though liked Day much more. Today I can't abide Death to the Daleks but still regard Day as one of my favorite stories of all time. My English teacher was aware I was a Doctor Who fan and kept encouraging me to join my school's established sci-fi club. I was reluctant, being an introvert and a naturally antisocial bastard, but eventually agreed. This actually turned out to be a very good thing. I made some very good friends, had some very good fun making ridiculously silly spoof sci-fi movies over the course of 3 or 4 years that none of you miserable fuckers are ever going to get to see, for the grace of God at least. And one of said new friends was a total who nut, was also considerably more well connected than I was, and had literally hordes of pirate copies of practically all the old Who stories I was, of course, desperate to see. He offered to tape me a couple if I wanted. He probably quickly regretted that offer, as I took massively advantage of his generosity over the next few years to see scores of stories I would have otherwise have had to wait years and years to see on the official releases. Many of these copies were in truly diabolical shape, of course, but that was part of the heady nostalgia and fun of those days in a way. The first batch of stories I managed to acquire from him were one from each of the pre-McCoy Doctors. The Daleks for Hartnell, the Mind Robber for Troughton, the Demons for Pertwee, Horror of Fang Rock for Tom, Black Orchid and Earthshock for Devoe, and Attack of the Cybermen for Colin, who I of course had already learned was the worst Doctor with the shittiest stories. An interesting selection. I thought the Daleks was alright but a bit boring, in contrast to my current opinion of it as one of the greatest stories ever. Though I was young and I guess the copy with its magical bend at the top of the screen didn't exactly help. Mind Robber I thought was okay, not keen to this day, didn't think the much fated Demons was all that even then, still don't, loved the fuck out of Horror of Fang Rock even though my copy was so bad it was actually in black and white, loved Black Orchid, loved Earthshock and, perhaps most to my surprise, loved the shit out of Attack of the Cybermen as well. Still do, too, and Attack was perhaps the first step of my journey to realizing how full of shit fandom and general fandom consensus could actually be. The poor fool actually included the first episode of Talons on the end of my copy of Fang Rock, and I practically forced him down until he agreed to tape me that classic as well. Next up was the broadcast of season 25, which I loved the hell out of and remains one of my top 10 favorite seasons of all time, with the wonderful Sylvester and Sophie pairing. After that, for the next few years until I fucked off to Zealand and thus cut off my supply of the illicit videos at least, I managed to see a whole buttload more, including Unearthly Child and Dalek Invasion, The Invasion, with a crude fan text explaining the plot of the missing 2 episodes, The War Games, Inferno, The Time Warrior, Planet of the Spiders, Ark in Space, Genesis, Zygons, Assassin, Sunmakers, Invasion of Time, all of Season 16, Destiny, City, the E-Space Trilogy barring Warrior's Gate, Traken, Castrovalva, the Black Guardian Trilogy, King's Demons, 5 Doctors, Warriors, Awakening, Resurrection, Androzani, and all of Seasons 22 and 23. Ironically enough, when I arrived in Zealand they were actually showing Who on the Kids' afternoon show on the ABC, and I got to see a lot of Season 17 and 18 I hadn't seen before, including Horns of Nimon, which I loved then and loved even more now. I did join a Who fan club down under for a while, but it wasn't quite the same somehow. The early 90s also saw early morning broadcasts of early Tom and Davison stories, including the likes of The Seeds of Doom, and by the mid-2000s, I had seen pretty much everything, with the likes of The Gunfighters and The Time Meddler being among my last. The very last classic Who story I thought I would ever see was Invasion of the Dinosaurs in 2004, which I really enjoyed. Of course it turned out to not be the last classic Who I would see, with the discovery of Enemy of the World and Web of Fear in 2013. And that, as they say, is my story.